My name is Zachary Palmer. I am a junior here at the college, majoring in history, minoring in politics and classical education, and I am a Winston Churchill Fellow. Larry P. Arnn is the 12th president of Hillsdale College. He received his BA from Arkansas State University and his MA and PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He also studied at Worcester College, Oxford University, where he served as Director of Research for the late Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill. From 1985 to 2000, he served as president of the Claremont Institute for the study of statesmanship and political philosophy. He serves on several boards of directors, and he previously served on the U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors for 2 years, for which he earned the Department of the Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Medal. In 2015, he received the Bradley Prize from the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation. A member of numerous organizations, including the Churchill Center, he is the author of 3 books, Liberty and Learning, The Evolution of American Education, The Founder's Key, The Divine and Natural Connection Between the Declaration and the Constitution, and What We Risk by Losing It, and, most recently, Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Dr. Arnn.
Thank you, Zach. Good evening. Have we enjoyed our CCA? Were we happy to get a chance today to look at Winston Churchill's butt? Because that doesn't happen every day, does it? Doug Jeffrey actually asked me, do you think that was a body double? And I said, you know, Doug, there are 3 butts that I've never seen. And one of them is Winston Churchill, and one of them is Albert Finney's, and the other is whoever that double might have been. Okay, I can't believe I said that. So, you know, the college has a big commitment to Winston Churchill, and that's because he's great. But I need to explain that because this is a college, and so we're supposed to explain what we do. And so I'm going to answer a few questions about it. I'm going to ask them of myself, and then later you can ask them. What has the study of statesmanship to do with liberal education? That's the first one. Do you know what liberal education is? Like Zach here. He's undertaking liberal education, and he just introduced me. And I'm significant around here, and he was serious about it, right? He never did that before. Everything he's doing in his life, he never did before, every big thing. And what does he need to study? He doesn't know what he's going to do with his life. He actually only needs to study things that last forever. He needs to get oriented about those. Liberal education is about those. Today, with some freshmen at lunch, is Carly here, the freshman? No, too bad. She effectively accused me of blasphemy today. And because her point was we treat the Greeks as important as the Bible. And I said, so, I'm guilty of blasphemy. Now, she loves the college. All of them did. They were all freshmen. It's easy to pick on them. And there was a young man here who's an applicant, you know, and he's dying to get in, and he's the friend of a member of our president's club. And so we're all there for this, like, really tense and significant lunch. So I got him with a bunch of freshmen, and we had a free-for-all. And I said, okay, Carly, you mean blasphemy? And she said, no, I don't. And I said, yes, you do. And she said, and I said, I accuse you of ignorance. Let's talk that through. Well, you know, by the end, 45 minutes, it was a sacred experience. Everything about it was. I was explaining to her what you can know about God just by thinking about it. And I showed her that. And she'd been raised by very decent people. And, she's here. She came from California. She can go to college anywhere she wants to if she got in here. She came here to the cold, in part because she thinks we'll teach her how to be. And I tried to help today. Mostly I tried to have an amusing time because it's easy around here. And at the end, I said, so you see, you can know these things about God. Do you know what you can know about God by reason, according to Thomas Aquinas? You can know that he can't move. You can know that he must be immaterial. You can know that he must be eternal. And he has to be those things. You can know that he can't change. I'll just give you one example. If you change, then that means one of three things. It means improvement or decay or changing for no reason. And all of three of those things are imperfections. We change. We're not God. That's what we do here. What's politics like? Politics changes. Politics is urgent. Politics is so often ugly. Why would you do that here? And I'll answer that question quickly. I haven't got to Winston Churchill yet. You don't discover the need to know the big things by thinking about them first. You discover them by choosing what to do. That young woman chose to come here. She's a good choice. I mean, because of her mostly, but we're pretty good too. And that's a question about the good. What shall I do? We're just as necessitous as dogs. We got to sleep every day. We get hungry. We got to make a living. But there's something else going on every time we choose. And that thing is, what's the right thing to do? And this right thing to do, even if we corrupt the idea, even if we just style everything right just because we happen to want it, the question of right comes up. And that question reaches up to God. Here's another reason why we study that. Winston Churchill said of Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, do you know, was a very great man. It's breathtaking. He had flaws, all that, right? But nobody like him. He writes of Hitler, you see these dictators on their pedestals, surrounded by the bayonets of their soldiers and the truncheons of their police. On all sides, they are guarded by masses of armed men and cannons and airplanes and forts. And they vaunt themselves before the world. Yet in their hearts there is unspoken fear. They are afraid of words. Words spoken abroad. Thoughts stirring at home, all the more powerful because forbidden. These terrify them. A little mouse of thought appears in the room, and even the mightiest potentates are thrown into a panic. A tyrant is the enemy of learning any high thing. That's the worst thing about them. And Winston Churchill knew that. Didn't go to college. I met Sir Martin Gilbert, through whom I met Penelope Arnn, in a little library in North London called the Wiener Library. And this library is, we were to meet there, and then I was to walk with him to the London School of Economics, where I was supposed to be a student, although I hardly ever went there. Moved to Oxford right away because he gave me a job, and I had to chase him down the stairs and say, where should I live? And he said, Oxford. I said, okay. So I moved over the weekend. But because of him, I met Penelope, my wife, right? That was a big day for me. But I walk in this library, and it's this quiet little library, and there are these two Jewish ladies running it, older ladies. And I'm kind of shy. I'm from Arkansas, you know, and never been abroad before. And I said, I'm looking for Martin Gilbert. And they knew immediately who that was. And they walked me over, and he's looking at a book. It's a primary school reader. And it's got the kind of primary colors in it. And he said, hello, nice to meet you. Look at this book. You know what it was? It was a textbook from Hitler's Germany. And the story in the textbook, it's a little storybook, pictures, and turn the page, and a few words on each page. And what was happening was some German children with blonde hair and blue eyes and brown uniforms and backpacks went into a butcher shop. And the butcher was a Jewish butcher. He actually looked rather like Bluto in the Popeye cartoons. And the plot of the story is that he was tempting these German children into the back, and he was butchering them. Primary school, little kids. And Martin Gilbert said, notice this. And he pointed because there are sides of pork hanging everywhere. And he says, notice that the color, the hue of the sides of pork is the same as the hue of the skin of the butcher. And nobody else is like that. That's education under a tyrant. You know what Churchill said education is? He didn't go to college. Today, if you hear a politician, Republican or Democrat, describe education, it's a little better recently. But if you hear them describe it, they never know what it is, right? They think it's success. They think it's, you know, whereas what Zach needs to know and what Carly needs to know is they need to know how to be. They need to know how to live their lives because their whole lives are in front of them, and everything turns on how they choose. And we don't know that today, see? And that means that we're going down the road where you find Hitler at the end, right? In 1946, the war's over. Churchill's become the greatest man in the world, and he goes to the University of Miami and gets an honorary degree. He always made the same joke when he got one. I've been so much better at receiving degrees than I was at taking exams. But I'll read you what he wrote. This is an age of machinery and specialization. I hope nonetheless, or all the more, that the purely vocational aspect of university study will not be allowed to dominate or monopolize the attention of the returning servicemen. Soldiers coming back from war. In 1953, I've known this for about a year, and as you know, I'm old now, and I've been studying Winston Churchill for a long time. In 1953, he's the prime minister of the country for the second time, and they're having a fight because they're starting adult education, and he won't let them bring the bill forth. The Secretary of Education doesn't understand what education's about. She wants it all to be vocational, just training for a job. Do you see how ungenerous that is? Because all you're going to teach them to do is to do what you teach them to do. Instead of teaching them to be human, helping them to learn to be fully human, right? And so he says, I have to only paraphrase this, I don't have the quote right here, but he says, for adult people to address themselves to the greatest books in their age, what a satisfaction. I was a late starter myself, he says. You see, he thinks human beings are ends, not means. That's why he saw Hitler for what he was. He goes on, engines were made for men, not men for engines. It ought to be part of our religion to see that our country is well governed. Well governed means, by the way, an education system and a governing system that treats you as the point of it all, the purpose. Expert knowledge, however indispensable, is no substitute for a generous and comprehending outlook upon the human story with all its sadness and all its unquenchable hope. What does that mean? That means that the stakes in politics are everything. And you can only play for the stakes in the right way if you understand that politics is not everything. And the great statesmen who save everything are the ones who know that. Why should we study Churchill? You see why we should study statesmen? Our mental weather is mostly taken up with not figuring out what you can know about God by reason as opposed to faith. That's a really wonderful thing to know. There's a book you should read. I read it when I was in graduate school, and I'm reading it again right now. And it's a perfect book for nighttime because each chapter is short. And it's complicated, but it's great. It's called the Summa Contra Gentiles by Thomas Aquinas. And I read it forever ago. I was told by my great teacher, I was trying to study the ethics, which I teach now, and he said, I wasn't getting it. And he said, go home and read the Summa Contra Gentiles and come back when you have. So I'm reading it again, right? And it starts with saying, the first book, there are 4 books, independent books, and the first one's about God. What's God like, right? Well, that's a glorious thing to do. And you can't do it if you're me for a long time because then you get sleepy and you got to sleep or you'll die, right? But mostly you don't do that. Mostly what you do is figure out what to do, make decisions, and make them right. And the faculty of doing that is called practical wisdom or prudence. And Aristotle says in book 6 of the Ethics that if you want to get good at that, study the people who have the reputation for being good at it, especially statesmen. And Winston Churchill leaves the richest record of any statesman. 50 books. Read them. I envy you the chance to read them for the first time. And then he was in the most significant events in human history. Alas, we live in an age where those are so recent, because we live in a very troubled time, something that Churchill knew. Why war? Why statesmanship? Why Churchill? Why war? You know, there are conflicts among people, and they're bound to be. And that's because they're not angels. There are going to be conflicts among nations. And the reason there are going to be many nations is because we don't all speak the same language. And politics arises from the gift of human speech, which is also the gift whereby we figure out what to do, if we figure out well. And so we're going to be organized in these communities. And you know, they're going to gather force, and they're going to build harmony if they're successful. And that makes them very fierce in war. And so there's going to be wars. And so then, how do you win them? You know, that thing I said about Churchill, that his greatness was understanding that politics was not everything. His greatness at war involved understanding that war was not everything. And that changed how he fought it. I'm going to explain that. It's really awesome how he did that. I mean, and then, you know, he wrote books about it so you can understand. He didn't like war. He was really good at it. You know, he fought first time he fought was in Afghanistan. He walks up and down upright behind the rocks. It's a war fought just like the Afghan war today. It's fought up in the rocks by the hills. And so he'd walk up and down so they could shoot at him. And then people stopped, and so they would write about him, writing back the reports and the dispatches, they call it, about the battles. And so they got used to that, so they didn't mention his name anymore. So he bought a horse and rode that up and down. And then the next place he fights is in the Sudan. Well, he went to Cuba too, but that was a kind of spy trip that pretended to be something else. But he goes to the Sudan, and he's in a cavalry charge. Last big one they ever had, the British. And people talk about him, about what he was like on a battlefield. Then the biggest thing, the best thing, was he went to South Africa. And they'd made a rule that you couldn't write articles for the press if you were a serving officer. And they made that rule for him because he was the most famous commentator on all of the wars he was in and became a public figure, including talking bad about the generals, and he was a second lieutenant. See? And so they made a rule that he couldn't do it. And so what he would do then is he would resign his commission and serve and write articles for a while, and then he'd join back up and serve some more. And at the moment, he gets on this armored train, and he knows it's a bad idea. He'd been on the dang thing before, but if you think about it for a minute, an armored train is a stupid idea. Because they're very heavily armored and stuff, but you know exactly where they're going. And they got to have the tracks. And so he said, well, I don't know. And this guy, Haldane, says, please, come with me. I want you to come. So he gets on the dang train, and it's attacked, and it's derailed. And he's a journalist, right? And they're all cowering, and there's hills on both sides, and rocks, and people behind it, and there's small arms fire and artillery fire. There were 13 killed. And everybody's in a panic. And so he gets out, and he walks the circle out in the open, around the locomotive, and investigated. Bullets coming down, and he doesn't notice them. God did not make such a force as I merely to stop a bullet. Churchill was confident. And so he comes and opens the door. And he says, wait, we can get this thing going. And then they work for an hour. He's the one that works out in the open. And they get the train going, right? And then you know what he says when it's over? He says, to Haldane, he's eventually captured, by the way. He could have got away, but he didn't want to leave the other guys behind. And of course, he escapes, by the way, and becomes a national hero and gets elected to Parliament. But on the scene, he says to Captain Haldane, he says, thank you for letting me do that. Isn't that weird? He said, the whole Derbyshire Light Infantry has seen that, and now I'm going to be elected to Parliament. He was a fighter. In the Second World War, he's one of two people that I've ever read about who was dashing in the trenches. Douglas MacArthur was the other one. He wore a white sash and had a baton and a pipe, and he would charge, with his baton and his pipe and his white sash. Churchill would go exploring with his troops in the trenches at night. And it would go like this. There's a really great memory of it written by one of his senior officers. And he'd be looking out over there, and he'd look around just like a little boy and say, let's go out there. And then they go crawl around and get up close to the Germans and hear them, right? His spirit rose in the face of war. But he hated it too. Then he's a politician. And then a big war comes, the First World War. And, people mistrusted Winston Churchill. And one of the reasons is they trusted him to tell the truth, and he was very ambitious and very quick. And that meant that they were always afraid that no matter what he got his mitts on, he was going to take it over. And that's because he did. All the time. It drove Neville Chamberlain crazy with that. He just couldn't be stopped. But at the beginning of both world wars, one of them, Herbert Asquith, is the prime minister, and the other, Neville Chamberlain, is the prime minister. Within 3 months of the war broken out, they made him the chairman of the committee to coordinate the whole war because he had energy and he knew what to do. John Colville, one of the best witnesses for Churchill, was a Chamberlain guy in the prime minister's office when Churchill took Chamberlain's place in May of 1940. And he kept a diary. It was illegal. Martin Gilbert found a document that we were soon to publish, and the document said they would do spoofs on each other, the people working for Churchill, and just make each other miserable. And one of the spoofs was a pretended memo from Churchill saying, "It's my understanding that you've been keeping a diary. This is a violation of the Official Secrets Act." And they give it to him. You know, they're all named John Peck, Eric Seals, Eric, and Colville, and the others give it to him. And he just sits there and he's just a hangdog. And their idea is they're going to let him go home and suffer and then come back the next day and tell him, but they can't bear it. He's so devastated, right? But he kept keeping his diary. And it's good that he did, because here's what he thought. They're Chamberlain people. He's steady. Churchill's a wild man. This is going to be terrible. And then 2 weeks later, he's writing, "Oh, this is how you fight a war." Churchill was good at it. He loved it, and he hated it. He made these points about war. The first one is, it isn't the point. You don't fight in order to fight. If you think that, you're Hitler. Do you know the Spartans didn't think that? And they were warlike, really. The Romans didn't think that. Only crazy people think that. And once in a while, small souls who just only know how to do that. Churchill was always clear, that's not what we do. We do that in order to do what we do. And then that brings up the second thing. I'll tell you, I invite you to have the experience of reading this, because it's just, you know, people will say to me sometimes, you know, because I happen to know a lot of politicians, and I've known some good ones, a few. And they'll say to me, you know, who's our next Churchill? And I always say, well, God will figure that out when he wants to, because it won't be for a while. And they'll say, do you think so-and-so is like Winston Churchill? And I'll say, yeah, he's very like him. You know, fought in 5 wars, commanded in the 2 greatest wars in history, wrote 50 books, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's just like him. George Bush and Ronald Reagan, I was asked that by. Reagan's closer, I think. But so this thing that he's good at, and the thing I'm telling you, when the wars broke out, every time a big one broke out, he had foreseen it, and he'd spend at least a decade trying to stop it, and failed, and then he thought, okay, now we're going to fight. Let's show them what that's like. See? And it's just like in the Army, by the way. I was on the board of the Army War College. Zach mentioned it. And what do you learn at the Army War College? There's rank, and then there's people who fought, and that cuts across rank, because war is very urgent, and you tend to pay more attention to talent in such a situation. And so Churchill gets promoted. They don't like him. Well, they came to love him. He became the greatest man in the world very late in his life. It happened in 1940. Because he just did amazing things. I'll describe one of them. But he's good, right? But he thinks, so here, the second thing, something's changing in the world. We live in the most dangerous age in human history right now. We live longer. We're less likely to be killed. Much more likely to be killed 10 million at a time. And it's happened more than once. We live in the age in which slaughterhouses are built, and whole communications are devised, and incineration systems are devised to dispose of human beings in ways that you'd hardly do to cows. Where'd that come from? And what does it mean for war? In 1898, Churchill is on a battlefield in the Sudan, and he sees a charge. And I think this is the earliest instance I can see of it. I actually need to find this. As you can see, I'm not paying any attention to my notes, so I'm lost. I can't find it, so I'll describe it. So in the River War, one of his very best books, and an early book, and in the chapter called The Battle of Omdurman, Omdurman's down on the Nile. And really one of the first, for sure, Islamic republics had taken the city of Khartoum, which is 1,000 miles down the Nile from Alexandria, where the mouth is up in the Mediterranean. And this Mahdi of Allah was his title. He took the city and he publicly beheaded a man named Gordon, General Gordon, a figure of the empire and a heroic man. And they sent evidence of it to London. And they said, we got to go get him. So they sent a camel corps, and it got chopped to pieces. The Nile is impassable for much of its length. And so they couldn't go by boat. And so then they employed an engineering kind of general named Kitchener, with whom Churchill had many dealings, much of them unhappy. And Kitchener, figured out how to do it. They put a whole bunch of stuff on boats, and they floated them down to the place where the Nile was impassable. And then they took the stuff off, and what it was a railway. And they built a railway around the shallow parts, back to the deep part. Then they put all the boats and all the troops and all the equipment on the boats, and on the locomotives, on the trains, and they took them down to the place, and then they put it all back on the boats, and now they've got a major army with gunboats outside Khartoum. And 35,000 dervishes charge, and the one that got the farthest got within 100 yards. And it was a football field, 150 yards, a football field and a half. They could hardly see the British lines. Churchill describes this, and you know what Churchill thinks he's doing because you know that story about what he said to Haldane. He said, I've won glory, I'm going to get elected to Parliament. And it would be vainglory, except he risked his life to get it. He was serious about it, right? But here, and see, this is the vengeance against the beheading of Gordon. It's an extremely popular war. And the British didn't lose 30 people. And they killed 20% of the dervishes. And Churchill is horrified. When he writes about it, I can just describe it. It's in that chapter, you'll find it. He says, the white flags, that's the frontline troops carrying big white flags of the dervishes, come over the hill. They have no sense of the impending tragedy. Of all of the varieties of arms they had, they were most inferior in artillery, and so they opened with that. And then they began to be slaughtered. And he describes it. It's beautiful. It's terrible and beautiful. He describes the bullets shearing through muscle and bone, and the sand and the sweat and the blood and the screaming. And then he moves to the next paragraph, and he says, the infantry back at the British lines fired steadily and stolidly. In rough paraphrase, although they were interested in the work, it became tedious. But they noticed that after each looked down the sights, there were fewer targets than the one before. Then they say that soon the barrels began to melt, and they had to bring water jackets and keep changing them, and they had to bring more. He's describing ammunition. He's describing a factory. There's a factory for killing. And he never calls the British brave. He calls the dervishes. And Churchill didn't like these dervishes. He didn't like that kind of people. He didn't like despotic religion. And he denounced it hard in this book. But at the time of the battle, only they are brave. And then he reflects to himself, he says, used to be bravery was the chief asset in war. Is it machinery now? That's a heck of a reflection for somebody 26 years old. And then he developed that for the rest of his life. He writes in an essay called, Shall We All Commit Suicide? Mankind has never been in this position before. Without having improved appreciably in virtue or enjoying wiser guidance, he's got into his hands at last the means of his own destruction. Death stands waiting at attention, silent and expected, waiting for a word from the frail being, so long his servant, now for once his master. He's afraid of war, afraid of what we'll do. In 1936, in What Good's a Constitution, he writes that we, free countries, we can't afford to be perpetually at war. Have you noticed that in the news lately? When we get into a war, we always go quoting Winston Churchill. We don't quote what he actually wrote. Because what he wrote was, if you're forever at war, then that disturbs the liberal society. The liberal society is where we get to be important. Just ordinary people. Right? But if everything is conscripted, as it must be, he says, the way war is going, then there will be no room for any of us to be free, and that means that's got to be stopped. You got to find a way to win, and win fast, and not fight if you can help it. He was always, did you know, in 1954, Winston Churchill refused Dwight Eisenhower to go to Vietnam with him. And Eisenhower then did a remarkable thing that 2 years later, it actually amounted to the destruction of the power, the public demonstration of the destruction of the power of Britain. Because in 1956, the British and the Israelis and the French attacked the Egyptians at Suez, and the United States made them stop. But in 1954, Admiral Radford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said to Churchill, he said, "We can help you in Egypt." And Churchill turned him down. He said, "You're going to go and spend the best you've got against proxies for which they care nothing." Why is that good strategy? So what I'm describing here is an entire life of a man who's a fighter and is good at it and loves it and tries to stop it on the argument that we must spare ourselves so we can live like free people. And when he sees Hitler coming, do you see why he understood him? He understood. Have you read about the score, the point system that they got in China now? And they're watching what you read because they're afraid for the same reason. So he knew him for what he was. And so he urgently sets about the job, getting the country to rearm because we're in a position to stop him without a fight. And we've got to do that. And then they won't do that. And they lie, cheat, and steal, in the most honorable way. And they pretend to be rebuilding, and they don't. First, they won't admit that they're going to try. Then they claim they're going to try, and they half try. Then they get serious about it, but it's late now. And so then, and remember this, we can only see Churchill after he became the greatest man in the world and did the greatest things he did. But of course, most of his life is not like that. Most of his life is him being the most reluctant guy to call on his people to sacrifice their way of life. But then 1940 comes, and in some kind of poetic and ironic cosmic justice, he's the one picked to fight the war. Have you seen the movie Darkest Hour? You can't understand what's great about that scene, that event that it describes, until you understand how reluctant he was to do that kind of thing. But now, the Germans have beaten the French, and the Germans are in alliance with the Russians, and we are distant. And so then, of course, as the France is collapsing, and he's flying back and forth begging the French to stay in the war. And he's picked prime minister because that's a piece of hard medicine. And at last, they're ready to take it. And so he goes over there and he begs them, and they quit anyway, having a treaty not to do it. And so he destroys their fleet in the port of Oran in North Africa. And he won't send them any more airplanes. And then France falls anyway, and so then Edward Wood, Lord Halifax, is the foreign minister, and he's the chief of the appeasers along with Chamberlain. And he brings a proposal conveyed through Mussolini, Hitler's henchman, not yet in the war, and says, we want to talk peace, we'll be really generous. And I want you to see, this is a dramatic demonstration of what life demands of us. And we'll never know until heaven whether we were right or not. I'll explain why. Because this guy, who's the one who's trying to stop this war from happening, he's the only one who doesn't want to open a peace conference. And the reason is it'll be in the papers, and then the whole war effort of Britain, pitiful thing that it is, will collapse. And he's the prime minister, but they don't vote in the cabinet. They're not voting over there today when the whole thing is collapsing. They have a discussion, and the prime minister has the authority to summarize what they've decided, and if you don't like it, you quit. And so if he says we're going to fight on, and Halifax says I quit, the government falls. He doesn't have the power. And so he had to do something more questionable than vote. He had to talk him into it. It's amazing that he did. He talks for an hour. He didn't have time to write the speech out, which is very uncommon. 2 people took notes, and we have the notes. And we know what he said. He described the war situation in blank terms. We're going to be up against overwhelming odds. There's going to be a naval battle. Remember, we still have a navy. But that will go the way of an air battle, and they have more airplanes. But they have to fight over here on our side. We don't know how that's going to go, but there's good hope. And then, if they land, the towns they're going to take first have names, like names in New England. And the Americans will come and help us. That's the hope. Remember, we're the hope. The only thing big enough. And you got to understand about Churchill, but at this point, he's familiar with the workings of the Great World War like no one else. He's as familiar with that as I am familiar with the operations of this college. And that's infinitely larger, right? But he can just think about it and see it. And he can see, gonna need us. I'm gonna have to talk him into coming, but meanwhile, I gotta hold on, right? And he closes the speech with this. And I'm asking you to remember the last person to say this. He says, I've been thinking in these last few days. I'll interrupt and say that 2 weeks after this, he's told the plans for resisting an invasion if they get ashore. And he records, we don't have the speech, but we record that he said that he records that he wrote a speech about what if the Germans land, because he'd been informed they're going to take southern England, and that means including London. And the speech was entitled, You Can Take One With You. That's like the Spartans, except for a whole country. That's to my wife's mother and father. My wife was born after that, which means he hadn't come home. No wife, no children. So at this thing, he says, I've been thinking in these last few days whether it is part of my duty to open negotiations with that man. And I believe that if I were for a moment to consider parley or surrender, every one of you would rise up and tear me down from my place. If this island story is to end at last, let it end when each of us lies choking in his own blood. He talked them into that. They leaped up and patted him on the back. And for the rest of his life, friend and enemy, he still had the same friends and enemies. They treated him like the greatest man in the world. And my point is, you can't be sure that was the right thing. Because you know what Britain lost? There's a lot of after-guessers. John Chamberlain, an excellent historian, right? He writes a book. That's what cost Britain its greatness. That's a factual point. And Churchill himself had made the case 1,000,000 times. We can't do that. And it's not like he just said, I'm the prime minister, you got to do it. He had to summon from himself a speech that there's no living person. He's responsible for that. And then, of course, he watched it collapse and become a little country. They were having to borrow money from us to get food after the Second World War, the greatest nation on earth for 200 years. He hated that. But you know what the choice was? Because when it gets to the end, and you can only make decisions like this when there's no alternative. This is what Churchill teaches about war. There are two final points. The first one is, if you get to the place where you're going to surrender your power to resist to the worst man in history, better to die. There are Frenchmen who have ancestors who signed orders to round up Jews because otherwise their families would be shot. Better to die. That's the first lesson. You don't make extreme judgments except in extreme circumstances. And then pray for the strength to make them. But the second was, do you know what this proved to Churchill? It's the greatest thing of all. It's what he lived his life to prove. His whole life he conceived it. He thought, these things are getting so big, war and production and nations and science, that people don't matter anymore. And sure enough, the doctrine of Hitler and the doctrine of Stalin is precisely that people don't matter anymore. It's history, it's the tides, it's the great movements. Throw up your hands. You have to be on the side of history, to quote a recent president. You see, or else everything is vain. But in the First World War, he writes this. He says that in the First World War, of course, he tried to avoid the trenches in the First World War, although he later fought in them well. And he devised a plan to get around them. And it was the Dardanelles, and it didn't work. And it was a disgrace, right? And so, of course, to justify it, he writes a 6-volume book. One of the greatest books ever written, in my opinion. Certain modern books. And he says in there, he says, that this year, 1915, the war started in August 1914. In 1915, excuse me, I have a phone call. Make the bad man stop. It's some friend of Bob Norton's from Sacramento, California, I'll bet you. So he says, sorry, where was I? Was I talking about something? He says, this moment, right here, this incredible conflagration could have been stopped. We could have got control of it. And then he says a very interesting thing. The paragraph begins, although this account pretends to deal with the vast theme, it will follow, I conceive, on the pathway that footsteps are decisive. He says, these should be studied and pondered over. Along these pathways where the footsteps are decisive, huge things can happen and they don't matter. But along this chain, he says, of commanding causation, who knows when they might set a stone rolling or take or omit some seemingly unimportant step that changes everything. Now that's an interesting thing, right? Because setting a stone rolling or taking or omitting some seemingly unimportant step. That's like chance. But he's talking about choice. What do chance and choice have to do with each other? Are they opposites or the same? In another place, he says, in mass effects in modern life, he says, you know, your own life is dominated by accidents. You know, I met my wife because I got on with Martin Gilbert, and because she was planning to leave Oxford and go work in London, but she got ill, and she couldn't go. I wouldn't know her but for that. You see, it's an extremely consequential thing to us and our children. But what if it was Napoleon, Churchill says? What if it was Churchill? Because that has consequences for millions. That means, you see, that the stuff we do is significant. And he says along these pathways, that's where you can see, quote, the profound significance of human choice and the sublime responsibility of men. And Churchill was searching for that all his life. And that means on the 28th of May, when he walked in that room, he was the only one who could have done that. He thought God put him there. Thank you. Thank you. I'll stop being emotional now. I'm done with all that.
Thank you, Dr. Arnn. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you.
You guys are a bunch of dunderheads. Dominic Whalen has a question. Oh, yeah. Cindy Merritt has a question. Get ready, Dominic.
Remember, I'm married to Martin Gilbert's younger brother.
That's right.
Yes.
Have you seen, you never met Martin Gilbert. Stand up, Peter. Peter looks just like him.
You mentioned to me once one of your favorite photos of Winston Churchill was after the Boer War.
Yeah.
When he was captured, and there was a group of officers, and he was one of them. And all of the officers their heads were down in defeat because they were captured. But he was the only one that stood defiant, like a bulldog, just standing and looking straight in the camera, and that was one of your favorite photos. I was wondering if you could expound on that, please.
Yeah, thank you. So it's he actually wasn't defiant. He was contemptuous. He fights in this action around this armored train. It goes on for a long time. There's a lot of deaths. And then he gets captured, and you know, they come riding up on horses to get him. He thought it was Louis Botha, later his friend and the president of South Africa, and it wasn't. But he never accepted that he could have been captured by anybody except the future president of South Africa. And he reaches down and he's going to shoot him, and he'd taken his gun off to work on the train. So he's just really frustrated, and he's captured. And so they march him in the rain for hours, and then they get to another railhead, and they put him on a train, and he rides on the train for hours, and they're pointing guns at him, and he converses with them and charms them and finds out all about where they're being taken. And he arrives with a plan to present to the commander to take the officers' quarters, seize the weapons, march to the stadium where the enlisted men are, liberate them, take the capital, and end the war. So it's really great. And along the way, he wrote a 1,000-word article of which we have a copy today. Isn't that crazy? Right? And so he gets off the train, and this train, and it's, you know, it's been a long time now, right? And this train pulls into the middle of Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, and there's about 20 guys, and they're lined up, and all but one of them, or they're lined up in ranks, and all but one of them is looking like this. They got their heads down. One guy's looking like this. I've always wanted to know his name. You know who it is, Richard? We need to get that picture and look that guy up. I'll bet there's a way to find out. We should go to South Africa and ask. Anyway, Churchill is off to the side. And remember, he's not a soldier. He's in a uniform-looking thing, but not like the rest of them. And here, I'll do it so you can all see me. He's off to the side, and there's this semicircle, thick, with the citizens of Pretoria staring at them. And they all look disheveled except him. And he's standing like this. Looking down his nose sideways at them, right? And I thought, I wrote this one time, if Hitler had seen that picture, he might not have turned his back away from Winston Churchill to go attack Russia, because that could be a bad mistake. Yeah, so anyway, I like that picture.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk.
Thank you.
I'll take a chance on asking a question or perhaps making a remark. Had Churchill been heated in the 30s and had been able to stiffen the resolve of the French and the British, and they had resisted Nazi expansion, there was considerable opportunity for the German General Staff to have intervened and perhaps opposed Hitler. So had Churchill been listened to in 33, 34, 35, and 36, isn't it a vast irony that his role in history might likely have been much smaller in terms of our recognizing it, even though his contribution might have been greater in terms of lives saved?
That all seems true to me. I mean, it's what he thought. And of course, it's a hypothetical and you never quite know. But what he thought was that the First World War was harder to prevent, although he worked at it, because nobody had really seen it. And the Germans in the First World War, they were not like Hitler. What they were really was a bunch of irresponsible rich kids who inherited a bunch of stuff and didn't know how to protect it. But Hitler was a very wicked thing, and you could see that if you looked. And then Germany is very weak when all this starts. And so it's just a matter of opposing them. And they'll stop. They have to. They don't have anything. And anyway, that guy's kind of crazy, isn't he? And a lot of people don't like him over there. So Churchill always called it the unnecessary war. The war, what shall we call this war, Prime Minister, now greatest man in the world? And he said, that's easy. This is the unnecessary war. He called it that many times. He wrote it many times. You see? So I think that the stupidity and blindness of us is what made that, because we knew better by then, or should have. And see, it's hard, though, because Churchill himself, we fight in Iraq now. And a lot of people, you know, when you go fight in Iraq, anywhere you go fight anywhere in America today, you always quote Winston Churchill. And so, on the one hand, this lesson from Hitler, that's a lesson to learn. But it's just like every principle. It applies in the circumstances if you get it right, and never in exactly the same way. So I had somebody important in the White House say to me one time, do you believe in freedom in Iraq? And I said, yeah. And he said, but, I said, well, that would be difficult, wouldn't it? And he said, why? They want it. And I said, do they? But anyway, I said, is that what you think it takes? And he said, what does it take? And I said, read the first 50 pages of the Federalist Papers. You know, it takes a lot of things. And he said, Winston Churchill founded Iraq. And I said, you know, you always know just enough to be dangerous. I said, you know, he was the head of the colonial office. He had fought for 2 years, a battle, a year and a half, in the British government to keep Britain from taking territory from the former Ottoman Empire. He didn't want it, didn't think they needed it, thought it'd be nothing but trouble. And so then he and T.E. Lawrence, his number 2, they decided to get out of Iraq the minute that they could. And so what that means is the principle is be prepared, and the principle is don't go involving yourself in stuff that you don't need to. And so which applies? Come to find out, we have to live our own lives, alas. And we'll do better, says Aristotle, if we study the people who really are good at making the great decisions. But you do have to study them carefully, because there's 100 places I can name where Winston Churchill did not want to get involved. But I think you're right about that he won his glory through something he tried to prevent.
Thank you.
Thank you.